Hello everybody! Final Fantasy 16 has now come and gone with its final DLC, Rising Tide, in the rearview mirror. I have finished its story and I have delved a little bit into its side content, and I got to say, I'm glad that Final Fantasy 16 exists, and I want this video to serve as kind of my final thoughts on this chapter of Final Fantasy, because I think it has its ups and downs, but I think its most promising aspect is its future potential and what it can do in the future. And in order to accurately ascertain that, let's go over my overall thoughts on Final Fantasy 16 real quickly. I think the combat is really solid. However, it has one crippling flaw, and that is Bahamut and Odin in my opinion. I'm just not a fan of their playstyle. In a game like Final Fantasy 16, with a combat loop like this, I like abilities that actively engage me in the combat situation going on at any moment in time. Bahamut, in my opinion, was far too passive or reliant on long channeled abilities, while Odin's abilities felt like they hit with a wet noodle, because they were all serving to build up to Zantetsuken, which is a cool ability but when you boil down the entire combat loop once you get that ability to just building up to Zantetsuken in stagger windows with limit break, it makes the combat feel kind of repetitive, boring, and one-dimensional. Because it's so powerful, it makes me feel stupid for not using it. However, the other primals like Phoenix, Ramu, Shiva, Garuda, and Titan, I absolutely love because their playstyles were built on these quick-fire abilities more often than not that allowed me to augment the battlefield or my situation and battle strategy on a moment-to-moment basis, and I felt really good for maximizing their potential because they flowed into that active combat loop. Most of the abilities felt impactful or felt like they synergized off of one another instead of boiling the entire combat loop down to only a couple of abilities. And funnily enough, I think two of my favorite icons were introduced with Rising Tide, with Leviathan and, insert spoiler here, screw it, I guess I'll just say it, Ultima. What a I guess just great return to form. I thought I wasn't going to like Leviathan when I first read its toolkit, when I first unlocked it. You had one ability that just felt like a Bahamut ability but with water, and its signature ability just turned your arm into a giant Leviathan, which looked always amazing, right? But it just turned into essentially a gun arm, and I thought that would be a little bit too dull or uninteresting, but the more and more I played it with Leviathan, the more I fell in love with this playstyle. That Leviathan arm, it allows for so much mobility in the gameplay. And the fights that took place in the DLC, you can beat them with whatever, don't get me wrong, but they felt especially designed with Leviathan in mind because it's purely cinematic goodness. Dodging around these giant open arenas with Leviathan's arms, you shooting them down or using charged beams and all that, it felt so good. And if I ever do another full New Game Plus of Final Fantasy 16, you bet your butt it's gonna be New Game Plus with a Leviathan. Made me an absolute believer in the Behemoth. I mean Leviathan. Behemoth is actually another thing. And then you unlock Ultima at the end of it all. And remember when games had really cool completionist rewards? Like, you beat the game, congratulations, here's a really cool thing. If you ever want to come back and play the game, have a nice little power fantasy. Ultima's like giga busted, and he's awesome. You grow these giant wings, you can group up enemies together, you turn into a giant death beam from the heavens itself, feeling like a Diablo Templar or Paladin or whatever. They basically give you Requiescat from Final Fantasy XIV. It's pure goodness. And it's great, because at that stage of the game, it's fine to just have fun with it, and not have to worry about the balancing and all that. You basically beat the game. Let the players have fun. And that's what they did, and it's great. I love that. And I think, especially after Rising Tide and the other DLC, I'm going to be looking back on the Final Fantasy 16 combat loop extremely favorably, because there's so much potential here. And what I would really like to see going into the future in regards to the combat is iterating on this. I would love to see another game in this style, because I do think it's more than just a DMC clone. But what I think the game should do in the future is iterate and expand on the basic melee combos available to you as the player. Because, realistically, they kind of just boil down to attack, spell, attack, spell, attack, spell, attack, spell, rinse, repeat. And you felt, especially in the mid and late game, that most of your damage was really coming from your iconic abilities instead of your melee combos. At least it felt like that to me. I would love to see a bit more fleshing out of those basic melee combos and stuff like that. Like, you can can still do some cool stuff, especially with proselytize from Ultima going into like aerial combos. You can still do some really cool stuff. I just want to see the basic combat loop and those combos fleshed out on and expanded. And I also think, I know the party system was a big, like, point of contention for a lot of people for 16, but I think a party system in the future with this style of combat has a ton of potential for essentially what I'm talking about. Imagine they give you a roster of characters, each with their own different combos and stuff like that you can pull off, with their own unique iconic abilities, and like in Rebirth maybe, you can swap between the characters on the fly in combat. How cool could that be? Like, that's my main takeaway from Final Fantasy 16. This is a really good blueprint and foundation to build off of in the future. And I think 16 on the whole will be known for its really high highs and epic moments, especially the icon fights, which are standouts, but it has some valleys, it has some low points. Personally, I'm not that big on the ending, it just didn't kind of do anything for me. I want a smidge more comedic relief. Don't get me wrong, I like the dark atmosphere and tone and mature feeling that 16 had going for it, because I think that also enabled those more fantastical, larger-than-life elements like the icon fights to really stand out. But it is Final Fantasy at the end of the day. I think it needs a little bit more comedic relief. Not on the level like Rebirth or anything, just a little bit more. And I hope in the future they're able to like cull or completely go in a different direction. There's like filler moments in the story. Like, remember all those like little boat arcs we had in base Final Fantasy 16 with Mid? I didn't mind Mid as a character, it's just every time we went from a hype moment, we had like a quest or two about like I was trying to find a piece for a boat. It felt like MMORPG pacing, which is not that good for a game that's short like 16 comparison to an MMO. Where because you have all this extra time, you can afford to have these moments of downtime. In a game like 16, I kind of just wanted to go boom, 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 if that makes sense. Or, if you're gonna have these filler moments to really expand on the characters and the interdynamics and all that, let that happen, but focus a little bit more in on the characters themselves instead of like this filler quest objective. I think near the end of the game, they hit a better balancing with this, especially with Jill, but it was still jarring every now and then. Do I even need to talk about the music for Final Fantasy 16? It's so good, right? If you played Final Fantasy 14, you knew we were going to get some amazing soundtracks, and if you didn't play Final Fantasy 14, well, now you can expect, and you probably know who Soken is. He is a god. I love his music so much, and the music in the DLC, Jesus Christ, it's so good. That Leviathan fight, oh, baby. I love that fight. Speaking of, let's talk about the DLC. Like, it starts kind of slow, right? Like, weirdly slow. And I think the back end of the DLC, or at least the second half, really carries it. Because you get some really awesome set pieces, decent dungeons, pretty good mini-bosses that I genuinely really enjoyed, and you get an awesome Leviathan fight, and it's legit one of my favorite encounters in the game. I think the DLC fights overall were amazing. I still think Omega is my favorite fight in the game. Mechanically speaking, I still think Omega is my number one. Then maybe Bahamut, but then it's like Leviathan and Titan for fighting that third spot, alongside Ultima. And while the side quests in the DLC felt extremely filler, like MMORPG, I would find these quests in Gridania quests. When you beat the main story and you get to the end of these quests, there's some decent mini-bosses that you can fight, like the Tonberry King. That was a really cool fight. Not like the most challenging thing in the entire world or anything, but it doesn't need to be. I thought it was just fun. And that's one of the biggest takeaways I have with Final Fantasy 16. Every time I play the game, it's just fun. And they give you more mechanisms to engage with the content and just have fun with it. Omega DLC was pretty short, but that actual entire encounter and dungeon was a ton of fun. And they give you like a roguelike mode in Rising Tide as well, and that's great. Probably not for me entirely, but if I ever return to Final Fantasy 16, it'd be decent to like dive into it every now and then. I love having it as an option. I think one of the biggest strengths of Rising Tide is its visuals. The game is absolutely gorgeous, and I think it goes to show that maybe the over-reliance on Primogenesis in the base game, especially in the latter half when you're doing a lot of side content and you're gonna be out in that world a lot, it muted the colors of the game a bit too much and didn't allow the visuals of the game to really shine. Because in Rising Tide, oh my god, dude, the set pieces, the frozen wave, mwah, chef's kiss. It was so gorgeous and so refreshing just to have that blue sky again. I will say this though, I don't know if this was on me somehow or whatnot, I don't think it was, but the DLC ran like crap. I was on performance mode and there was no way I was getting 60 FPS. Hell, I may have gotten 60 FPS in the Leviathan fight, and that was pretty much it. Makes me kind of wish I just waited for the PC port, but it ran weirdly bad, like shockingly poorly. I think overall, Final Fantasy XVI will go down as one of the more polarizing and controversial Final Fantasies because of its sheer shift in direction from the series of old. Naturally, people aren't going to be a fan of that if they liked and really just wanted more of what Final Fantasy always had been before, whether that is tone, atmosphere, or gameplay in some degree. And I can understand those frustrations, right? And I think at the end of the day, though, Final Fantasy is one of those series that kind of always shifts and evolves to try and find some new identity for its new numbered release. I'd be really interested to see this combat style expanded on and iterated on in the future. I don't think it was perfected here. I think it was a really solid foundation that can be built up and expanded on and fleshed out in the future, especially with a party system, and fleshing out basic melee combos. You reduce some of the filler and the downtime, remove a style of play like Zantetsuken as well, and I think they have a lot of potential to have a really great game in the future in this style as well. I'm not that big on the ending, though I am extremely picky when it comes to endings. I've talked about that before, though. I will say the DLC story was way shorter than I thought. I probably just misremembered an interview or something. I was under the impression that the DLC would last about 8 to 10 hours. let me check my stream VODs. Yeah, I got about 5.5. More like 5 because I spent like half an hour yapping. It could be like 8 to 10 hours if you're counting in, the roguelike mode they added, and that's probably what they meant. I'm not particularly upset about it. In like retrospect, I think Rising Tide, gameplay-wise, was well-paced. Because especially I didn't care that much about the actual narrative going on because it takes place right before the ending, and if you know what the ending is, there's not much stake for me here, or not much of a reason for me to really care. But Leviathan was really cool. I love the fight. I'm glad the DLC exists. And I'm glad that I played Final Fantasy XVI. Is it perfect? By no means. Does it have flaws, and deep ones at that? Absolutely. Do I think it also brings a lot of interesting ideas to the table that can be expanded on in the future for Final Fantasy? Absolutely as well. And I talked about this before though. I like this combat system, but I also want to see them give a turn-based on ATB turn-based style of combat a try again for Final Fantasy. It doesn't have to be like Final Fantasy 17, it could be like a smaller spin-off or whatever. And what about Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler? Yeah, but let's be fair, they do feel different to Final Fantasy's turn-based. I'd just like to see a game like that style return in the future just to see how it would be received. More than anything. I think there's a space for multiple different kinds of Final Fantasy to exist in the future, and I think we're seeing that with the 7 games and now 16. I think for the longest time they were kind of like testing the waters to see what kind of real-time action combat system they wanted, and I think they're really onto something here with 16 and Rebirth. So hey, I walk away from Final Fantasy 16 glad that I played the game. It's not my favorite Final Fantasy of all time, but it's certainly not my least favorite, and I would put it definitely above average for me. And I think 16 has some of the hypest moments in the franchise as well, and I love Clive as a protagonist. Easily one of my favorite protagonists in all of Final Fantasy. So yeah, Final Fantasy 16. I think we definitely found our flame. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And leave a comment down below with your thoughts, your opinions, your review of Final Fantasy 16. Have you played it? Have you not played it? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and what you liked about it, what you want to see from it in the future as well, in terms of either mechanics or maybe even story or whatnot, and what you didn't like. Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and to hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.